Search teams tirelessly scoured every possible place: rivers, open fields, old wells, and abandoned buildings in the hope of finding even the smallest clue. Meanwhile, the entire nation watched with bated breath, following each new development on television and in the press. What began as a heartbreaking disappearance soon grew into something much larger. Marta's case became a national cause, shedding light on the deep flaws and inefficiencies within Spain's investigative and judicial systems. Despite the passing years, endless investigations, court hearings, and countless public demonstrations, the Del Castillo family refused to give up. Their unwavering determination turned Marta's tragedy into a catalyst for social reflection and change. Their struggle sparked nationwide discussions about justice. Today, Marta's name continues to resonate across Spain. It stands not only as a symbol of loss, but as a powerful reminder of empathy, collective action, and the unrelenting pursuit of truth even when that truth seems forever beyond reach. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. Marta del Castillo Casanueva was born on June 19, 1991, in Seville, Spain. To her loving parents, Eva Casanova and Antonio del Castillo. From an early age, Marta was known for her cheerful spirit, her dedication to family, and her kindness toward others. She attended a local high school where her friends described her as outgoing, loyal, and full of dreams for the future. At just 17 years old, her life appeared to be heading toward a bright horizon, until one evening changed everything forever. On January 24, 2009, Marta was at home chatting online with her best friend Silvia Fernandez. The two spoke about ordinary teenage things: school, plans for the weekend, and Marta's relationship with her boyfriend Miguel Carcaño. Around dusk, Marta suddenly ended the conversation. She told Silvia that she had to leave quickly because Miguel was waiting for her downstairs. Marta mentioned that they needed to talk about some issues in their relationship and promised she would tell Silvia everything when she came back. Her father happened to see her in the hallway as she was heading out. He advised her gently not to get on Miguel's motorcycle, perhaps sensing something uneasy about the situation. Marta only smiled, gave him a quick kiss on the cheek, and assured him she wouldn't be long. It was 5:30 p.m. when she left home, her family's last memory of seeing her. As the evening turned into night and Marta didn't return, concern began to grow in the household. Her parents tried to stay calm at first, assuming their daughter might have gone to visit a friend or stayed out longer than expected. But as the hours dragged on, that calm turned into deep anxiety. Eva began calling everyone she could think of: friends, classmates, and even Miguel himself. Almost everyone told her the same thing: she must be with Miguel. However, Miguel did not answer his phone. When repeated calls went unanswered, Marta's father decided to go directly to Miguel's house. He rang the doorbell several times, but no one came to the door. That night, uncertainty began turning into dread. Eventually, they reached one of Miguel's close friends, Samuel Benitez, who claimed that Miguel had dropped Marta off at his house around midnight. But it was only 11:45 p.m., and his statement immediately raised suspicions. By 2 a.m., with no sign of Marta and no credible information about her whereabouts, her family reported her missing to the authorities. None of them could have imagined that this report would mark the beginning of one of Spain's most haunting and publicized criminal cases in modern history. Even after filing the report, the family felt helpless. Hours passed with no immediate police action. By 1:30 p.m. the next day, a third report was filed out of growing desperation. Only 17 hours after the first call for help, law enforcement formally began the search for Marta, following procedural timelines that frustrated and devastated her parents. In the days following her disappearance, the Del Castillo family began organizing their own efforts. They spoke to the press, distributed posters, and reached out to the community for help. On January 27th, a press conference was held where Marta's parents publicly appealed for information. The response was overwhelming. The next day, Over 2,000 people filled the streets of Seville holding signs and chanting under the emotional slogan, "We are all Marta." As the days passed, public solidarity only intensified. By February 7th, a second demonstration gathered more than 3,000 participants, all united by the hope of bringing Marta home. National television channels covered the case daily, and newspapers across Spain featured her photo on their front pages. Marta's name became a symbol of both collective sorrow and unwavering determination. After 21 days of relentless searching, on February 13, 2009, the investigation took a shocking turn. Police detained Miguel Carcaño, who was then 20 years old. During questioning, he confessed to having taken part in Marta's disappearance and claimed that he had not acted alone. Miguel identified his friend Samuel Benitez as an accomplice, alleging that Samuel had helped him afterward. Samuel initially confirmed parts of Miguel's story, though inconsistencies soon emerged. As the investigation widened, Miguel implicated additional individuals: Javier Garcia Marin, known as El Cuco, as well as his own half-brother Francisco Javier Delgado, and Delgado's girlfriend Maria Garcia. Within days, all 5 suspects were taken into custody. However, what followed was a maze of contradictions. Each suspect offered a different version of events, some retracting their statements entirely. While police continued to interrogate them, specialized teams began searching the Guadalquivir River, hoping to find definitive evidence that could lead them to Marta. On February 16th, Miguel repeated his confession before a judge, but this time he introduced new contradictions, suggesting that police pressure had led him to make false statements. His friend Samuel, on the other hand, distanced himself from the case completely, insisting he had nothing to do with Marta's disappearance. Then, on March 18th, Miguel requested to make another official statement. He dramatically changed his story again, accusing both himself and El Cuco of having harmed Marta. These inconsistencies complicated the investigation further, forcing the judge to reevaluate the search strategy. After weeks of searching the river with no success, authorities redirected their efforts to a landfill site, following Miguel's shifting testimonies. Marta's father, desperate for answers, speculated that the evidence might have been destroyed elsewhere, as one of the suspect's relatives worked in a biological waste facility. Though the theory gained media traction, investigators found no solid evidence to confirm it. As the months passed after Marta del Castillo's disappearance, the investigation transformed into one of the most followed and emotionally charged criminal cases in Spain's modern history. On November 16, 2009, one of the key figures in the case, Javier Garcia Marin, better known as El Cuco, reached the maximum term permitted for preventive detention under Spanish law. The system could not keep him in a juvenile facility any longer without trial. Therefore, he was transferred to a supervised apartment under the watch of social services, awaiting his court date. 2 years later, in February 2011, El Cuco once again stood before the court, this time facing serious accusations. The charges against him included abuse and homicide, though his defense insisted there was no direct proof linking him to either. Despite the public's frustration, the legal process required evidence beyond doubt. Ultimately, El Cuco was acquitted of the gravest accusations due to insufficient evidence, but was convicted of obstruction of justice and concealment, resulting in a sentence of 2 years and 11 months. This ruling left the public divided. Some believed justice had been served within the boundaries of the law, while others saw it as a devastating failure to deliver accountability. After many procedural delays, October 17, 2011, marked the start of the major trial, the one that would bring before the court the 4 adult defendants: Miguel Carcaño, Samuel Benitez, Francisco Javier Delgado, and Maria Garcia. The courtroom was tense, packed with journalists, relatives, and members of the public who had followed the case for nearly 3 years. When Miguel Carcaño took the stand, he appeared subdued, speaking in a low tone. For the first time, he offered new details about what he claimed happened on that fateful night. He stated that during a heated argument, he had struck Marta with an ashtray, causing her death. He insisted that his earlier claims, where he had mentioned other forms of mistreatment, were false and said he had invented them out of desperation. His brother Francisco Delgado His brother's partner Maria Garcia and their friend Samuel Benitez all denied involvement. They declared they had no knowledge of what happened to Marta or where she might be. Each of them described Miguel as unstable and manipulative, suggesting that he was fabricating stories to shift the burden of guilt away from himself. As the proceedings advanced, the forensic police presented crucial findings. On November 22, 2011, investigators confirmed they had detected traces of Marta's DNA on Miguel's jacket. Additionally, they found a mixture of genetic material belonging to both Miguel and Maria Garcia on a roll of fabric tape discovered at the scene. Further analysis revealed DNA traces of Francisco Delgado and Maria Garcia on an extension cable that was also collected as evidence. These findings contradicted the statements of the accused, who continued to maintain their innocence. Particularly, Maria Garcia's earlier testimony, claiming she had only been at the apartment briefly in the early morning and knew nothing about the events, fell apart under scrutiny. Investigators publicly concluded that she had not told the full truth, and she was formally accused of covering up what had happened. Fingerprints added more complexity. Investigators discovered 5 distinct prints on several bottles found inside the apartment, one belonging to El Cuco. Of the 5 young people implicated, the only one without physical evidence against him was Benitez, though by then, public opinion had already judged them all harshly. Every day of the trial was a spectacle in Seville. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse shouting Marta's name and demanding justice. The atmosphere was charged with emotion. Police cordons had to be reinforced to control the crowds, yet even then, people pressed forward to catch a glimpse of the accused. When Delgado and Maria Garcia arrived, they wore balaclavas and dark sunglasses, attempting to shield their faces. But that only fueled the crowd's anger. Some onlookers shouted insults, while others tried to pull off their disguises, insisting that the public deserved to see the faces of those accused. Television crews broadcast live footage, and nearly every Spanish household was tuned in to the updates. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution demanded significant prison sentences. Decades behind bars for Miguel, and several years for the others for concealment and obstruction. Over 90 witnesses, including police officers, forensic specialists, and neighbors, testified. The evidence presented ranged from 30,000 monitored phone calls to crime scene photographs and DNA analysis from the apartment at Leon III Street, where much of the investigation had centered. Meanwhile, the media landscape surrounding the case grew increasingly complex. At one point, El Cuco's mother appeared on television with her face covered, claiming that both she and her son were innocent and had no information about Marta's whereabouts. Her televised appearance caused outrage when it was revealed that she had been paid 10,000 euros for the interview. Journalists criticized the network for profiting from the family's pain, while Marta's parents demanded that any money earned be used toward the young man's sentence or donated to charitable causes. Public opinion was sharply divided. Some argued that media exposure was necessary to keep the case alive, while others condemned the sensationalism that had overtaken the tragedy. Despite the controversy, one fact remained clear. The Del Castillo family's resilience continued to inspire thousands of people across Spain. Amidst the courtroom tension, a surprising witness took the stand. A taxi driver who claimed to have transported Francisco Delgado on the night of Marta's disappearance. The driver testified that he remembered the passenger vividly because, not long before that night, a fellow taxi driver had been killed on the job, making him extra cautious about every detail. He recalled a bald man with a beard, matching Delgado's description, carrying a plastic bag and looking unusually tense. The driver said he took him directly to Leon XIII Street, precisely the address under investigation, and that the fare had cost 8 euros. However, Delgado's defense lawyer challenged this testimony, arguing that the fare for such a short distance should have been around 5 euros at the time, not 8, a difference used to cast doubt on the witness's reliability. When Marta's parents were called to testify, the courtroom fell silent. Their words carried the weight of unimaginable pain. They explained how the years of uncertainty and heartbreak had destroyed their peace of mind. Both parents had to leave their jobs. They were under psychiatric treatment and struggling with deep depression. Marta's younger sisters, once lively and full of energy, had also suffered immensely from the absence of their beloved sibling. The family pleaded not for vengeance, but for closure. for a truth they could finally live with. Their testimony moved the entire court, and even the judges appeared visibly affected. In January 2012, the jury's verdict was announced. To the shock of many, only Miguel Carcaño was found guilty of Marta's murder, while the others were acquitted due to lack of sufficient evidence. Miguel received a sentence of 21 years and 3 months in prison and was prohibited from residing in Seville or contacting Marta's family for the next 30 years. In addition to his 21-year and 3-month prison sentence, Miguel Carcaño was ordered to pay part of the trial costs and provide financial compensation for the immense moral harm caused by Marta's disappearance and death. The court required him to pay 280,000 euros to her parents, Eva Casanova and Antonio del Castillo, and an additional 30,000 euros to each of Marta's younger sisters. The payments were meant not as material reparation, but as symbolic recognition of the unquantifiable pain endured by the family. Meanwhile, Francisco Javier Delgado, his partner Maria Garcia, and Samuel Benitez were acquitted and released. The court found there was no definitive evidence placing them at the scene of the crime at the critical moment. Their release sparked outrage across Spain. To the public, it seemed that justice had only touched the surface, leaving deeper truths buried beneath layers of doubt. The following year, the situation became even more strained. Both Delgado and Benitez, now free, filed claims demanding that Marta's family pay their share of the legal expenses incurred during the trial. The move shocked the nation and was perceived as an act of cruelty toward a family already devastated by loss. In response, Antonio del Castillo vowed to continue his fight for justice, not only within Spain but on an international level. He publicly stated his intention to take the case to Strasbourg, home of the European Court of Human Rights, arguing that Spain's legal framework had failed his daughter. He described the system as outdated, too lenient, and unable to protect victims or their families. In December 2011, Marta's mother, Eva Casanova, wrote a heartfelt letter addressed directly to Miguel Carcaño in prison. Her words were not filled with anger, but with sorrow and a desperate plea for closure. She asked him to end what she called the torture of uncertainty, to tell the truth about what happened and where her daughter. She longed for a place to bring flowers, to sit, and to speak to her daughter, even in silence. The letter was sent to the prison where Miguel was held, but no answer ever came. The silence was deafening, prolonging the family's agony. On January 24, 2012, exactly 3 years after Marta's disappearance, thousands of people across Spain gathered once again to honor her memory. Demonstrations took place in Seville, Madrid, Granada, and Valencia, with banners bearing messages such as "Justice for Marta" and "We have not forgotten." Candles were lit in plazas, schools held moments of silence, and citizens of all ages joined marches to show solidarity with the Del Castillo family. Inside prison, however, Miguel's life had grown increasingly isolated. Other inmates, aware of the crime he had confessed to, threatened him repeatedly. To protect him, authorities placed him in a therapeutic module where he had minimal contact with others. He refused visitors and avoided phone calls, living in a kind of self-imposed silence. Over time, Miguel became notorious for changing his version of events. In prison, he produced not 1, not 2, but 7 different confessions, each contradicting the previous one. His shifting stories exhausted investigators and lawyers alike. Several of his defense attorneys eventually resigned, citing their inability to reconcile his inconsistencies. In 2013, Miguel presented what would become his 7th version of the crime, one that dramatically altered the narrative once again. This time, he implicated someone close to him, his own half-brother, Francisco Javier Delgado. In this new account, Miguel described a heated argument over the mortgage for their shared property at Leon 13th Street. According to him, tensions flared over a fraudulent bank loan, and the confrontation escalated into a physical altercation. At that very moment, he said, Marta intervened, attempting to calm the situation. It was during this confrontation, Miguel alleged, that his brother struck Marta. Afterward, Miguel claimed, Delgado made a mysterious phone call. Miguel insisted he did not know who his brother had contacted, but soon after, he fled the apartment in panic, leaving Marta inside the room. Despite everything, Marta's parents believed that Miguel's final version could hold some truth. They chose to forgive him, at least in part, hoping that compassion might lead him to reveal more. They even petitioned for the case to be reopened, requesting a new investigation that would focus on Delgado. But the prosecution and presiding judge rejected the idea, arguing that Miguel's credibility had been undermined by his numerous conflicting statements. Still, Antonio del Castillo refused to give up. In an act of profound humanity, he personally visited Miguel in prison. During one meeting, he offered him a deal. If Miguel helped locate Marta, the family would ensure he had a home to return to after serving his sentence. In a symbolic gesture, Antonio even purchased the apartment at Leon XIII, promising Miguel it could one day be his if he told the truth. The search for Marta became one of the most expensive and extensive operations ever undertaken in Spain. It involved both land and underwater searches, spanning rivers, landfills, and rural properties across Andalusia. The first search took place in the Guadalquivir River, where divers spent weeks combing the murky waters. Investigators attempted to recreate the suspect's version. However, inconsistencies quickly emerged. The scenario described: 3 young men, El Cuco, Miguel, and Benitez, traveling on a single motorcycle while carrying Marta, proved physically impossible. In the reenactment, the weight caused the dummy used for simulation to fall the moment the engine started. Later, when Miguel suggested that evidence had been disposed of in a trash container, police redirected their efforts to the landfill that processed Seville's waste. Experts estimated they would have to sift through nearly 40,000 tons of refuse to find anything meaningful. For 32 days, teams of workers, aided by specialized dogs and heavy machinery, searched tirelessly. They found nothing. Each time Miguel changed his version, authorities launched new searches on 4 in total across different areas of Seville and neighboring towns. At one point, the Interior Minister Alfredo Pérez Rubalcaba had to temporarily suspend the operations because the Ministry of Economy and Finance had run out of available funds for the ongoing excavation. By April 2013, 4 years after Marta del Castillo's disappearance, the case that had shaken Spain was still open, unresolved, and emotionally raw. That spring, Carcaño introduced yet another version of events. This time, he pointed directly to his brother, Francisco Javier Delgado, accusing him of being the true culprit. He also identified a new location, a vast rural area in the municipality of La Rinconada, on the outskirts of Seville. Although his credibility had been nearly destroyed after so many conflicting versions, the gravity of his accusation was impossible to ignore. The authorities, under mounting public pressure and at the urging of Marta's family, decided to authorize a new search. Carcaño himself agreed to accompany the officers, traveling with them to the countryside under heavy guard. Once there, investigators quickly realized that Carcaño's directions were vague at best. He could not recall exact coordinates, claiming only that he remembered fields, fences, and a small path by some trees. He drew a rough sketch on paper, marking where he believed the evidence had been discarded. Despite the lack of precision, the search teams pressed on. Over several weeks, 6 different farms across La Rinconada were excavated. The team employed advanced technology, including georadar surveys, to detect any anomalies in the soil. Specialists focused on locations where earth movements had been registered in recent years, hoping to find even the slightest clue. In total, an area of 10,000 square meters was scanned and dug. Heavy machinery, forensic experts, and police officers worked side by side from sunrise to dusk. Still, as the days turned into weeks, the results remained the same. Nothing was found. The disappointment was crushing. Each failed attempt seemed to reopen the family's wounds, and the search was finally suspended once again, this time at the parents' own request. It was agreed that any new operations would pause until 2015, unless credible evidence surfaced. The public ministry, meanwhile, filed a motion requiring the defendants to jointly reimburse the Ministry of the Interior the sum of €66,329, the estimated cost of the failed searches and forensic efforts. Around this time, a mysterious figure named Oscar entered the picture. He was introduced to Rosalia Garcia, the mother of El Cuco, under the pretense of being a criminal sympathetic to her struggles. In reality, Oscar was an infiltrator, working quietly and methodically to gather information that could reignite the case. Oscar's mission was simple but emotionally complex: earn Rosalia's trust and extract any possible confession that could lead to Marta. Over time, he succeeded beyond expectations. They began to meet frequently, sometimes every 2 or 3 days, and spoke daily on the phone. Rosalia eventually trusted him completely, even giving him a set of keys to her house. Their relationship evolved into one of familiarity and emotional dependence. They shared confidences, took long walks by the beach, and exchanged stories about life, guilt, and the weight of secrets. Oscar even fabricated plans about leaving Spain together, telling her that once her son's legal troubles were over, they would start fresh somewhere in Eastern Europe. For 2.5 years, Oscar collected an extraordinary archive of material, more than 600 hours of recorded conversations between Rosalia, her social circle, and occasionally El Cuco himself. During this time, El Cuco had already received permission for temporary release from prison. On one occasion, while talking to Oscar, he made an unguarded remark. Oscar asked casually, "Do you think the police are still following you?" Without hesitation, El Cuco replied, "Of course they are. They'll keep watching me until they find out where we left Marta." Realizing what he had just admitted, he immediately backtracked, insisting he had meant something else, that he hadn't been involved at all. Oscar, maintaining his composure, pretended not to notice the slip and continued the conversation as if nothing significant had happened. In other recordings, El Cuco could be heard mocking investigators, joking about how they would never find the body, while his mother, Rosalia, criticized the police for not tracking her phone calls. The tone of those exchanges painted a chilling portrait of indifference and arrogance. Yet despite Oscar's dedication, the 600 hours of audio never made it into court proceedings. Bureaucratic red tape and procedural disputes prevented the recordings from being officially admitted as evidence. For years, they remained in legal limbo, ignored, dismissed, and nearly forgotten. It wasn't until 2022, a full 13 years after Marta's disappearance, that Oscar's work finally bore fruit. By then, Spain had changed. Laws had evolved, public opinion had matured, and the demand for justice in cold cases had grown stronger. On May 26, 2022, the case re-entered the courts. Crowds gathered once again outside the courthouse in Seville. Neighbors, supporters, and journalists surrounded the building, eager to stand by Marta's family on this long-awaited day. Many had followed the case since 2009. Others were too young to remember the initial events, but had learned about Marta through documentaries and social campaigns. As proceedings began, Rosalia and her son, El Cuco, arrived under heavy police protection. The pair attempted to conceal their identities. El Cuco wore a large hoodie, a balaclava, dark sunglasses, and gloves, while Rosalia covered herself with a mask, headscarf, and tinted glasses. Despite their efforts, the crowd recognized them instantly. Years earlier, in 2011, both El Cuco and his mother had given statements denying any involvement in Marta's disappearance. El Cuco had claimed he was not at the Leon 13th Street apartment that night. According to him, he was with friends until 11:30 p.m., then returned home, where he supposedly ran into his mother's partner taking out the garbage. After that brief exchange, he said he went inside and stayed there the rest of the night. Rosalia's story mirrored her son's, but with slightly different details. She stated that she and her partner had gone out for drinks around 11:30 p.m. and didn't return home until 1:30 a.m. on January 25th, when she found her son already asleep. However, during new interrogations, inconsistencies emerged. El Cuco eventually confessed that on the night of January 24th, 2009, Carcaño had called him, asking for help after something terrible had happened. Along with Samuel Benitez, El Cuco admitted to using his mother's car to drive to Leon 13th Street, where Delgado was also present. Meanwhile, Rosalia was reportedly still at a bar that night, staying out until 4:30 a.m. When she finally returned home, her son was not there. When the investigation revisited these contradictions, both Rosalia Garcia and her son were charged with perjury for lying under oath and obstructing justice in a case that had already consumed over a decade of the Spanish judicial system's time and resources. Eventually, both accepted their guilt, acknowledging that they had misled the investigation. The courtroom atmosphere was solemn. Marta's parents attended the hearings, clinging to a small hope that perhaps this time, some truth would finally emerge. However, when the trial began, the judge unexpectedly suspended the scheduled witness statements, including the highly anticipated testimony from Miguel Carcaño himself. The decision left Marta's family devastated. They had hoped that Miguel, after all these years, might finally reveal the location of their daughter. On June 9, 2022, the long and exhausting legal process against Javier Garcia Marin, better known as El Cuco, and his mother, Rosalia Garcia, finally concluded. The court found both guilty of perjury, lying under oath and obstructing the course of justice, for providing false statements years earlier during the investigation into Marta's disappearance. The judge sentenced them to 2.5 years in prison, alongside a fine of €1,440 each. Additionally, they were ordered to pay €30,000 in civil damages to Marta's parents, Eva Casanova and Antonio del Castillo. But for Marta's family, no financial penalty could ever hold meaning. Money, as Antonio said outside the courthouse, cannot buy truth, nor bring our daughter home. Later that same year, in an unexpected move, the investigative judge overseeing the case authorized a new line of inquiry. He approved a request to have a digital forensic expert analyze the mobile phones of both Miguel Carcaño and Marta del Castillo. For Marta's parents, this represented a final glimmer of hope. Perhaps technology, which had advanced significantly since 2009, could uncover what years of human searching could not. However, the authorization came with strict limitations. The judge did not allow the same analysis to be carried out on the phones of the other individuals involved, Delgado, Benitez, or El Cuco, on the grounds that no new or direct evidence existed linking them to fresh leads. For the Del Castillo family, this restriction felt like another door closing. Still, they clung to the idea that even one device could hold a clue. A signal, a timestamp, or a forgotten message that could change everything. When officials approached Miguel Carcaño to request his consent to access his phone, he immediately agreed. In fact, he encouraged it. According to his own words, he was certain that the examination would prove his brother's guilt once and for all. But the investigation's primary objective was not to reopen the criminal charges. It was to locate Marta, to find out where she was, not necessarily who was most responsible. Despite that, the new analysis came to nothing. The forensic expert, though authorized, never submitted his final report. In November 2022, the Civil Court of Seville issued its final decision on the matter. The court formally closed the separate investigation dedicated to locating Marta, declaring that the statutory period for legal inquiry had expired. On March 18th, the day most people were still caught up in the afterglow of St. Patrick's Day celebrations, Jaime seemed to vanish without a trace. Jaime didn't answer her phone, ignore emails, and failed to show up for work. It was as if she had been quietly erased from her own life. At first, people thought it was nothing unusual. Maybe she had taken an unplanned trip or just needed some time alone. But soon, the oddities began to pile up. Her car, usually parked in its familiar spot outside her apartment, was gone. The neighbors, who rarely exchanged more than a polite nod with her, admitted they hadn't seen her for several days. Her parents started calling more often, their voices tight with worry, but no one ever picked up. They reached out to her friends, her colleagues, anyone who might know something, but every lead ended the same way, with a helpless shrug. And as the hours turned into days, it became clear that her silence wasn't a choice. It was the consequence of something far more troubling and far more dangerous. Every crime has its own story, and we're here to tell it to you, our dear viewers. Like, comment, and subscribe. Stay with us. Everything that surrounded Jaime Jean Liaddy was arranged with almost mathematical precision, as though her entire existence operated according to a private formula that she alone understood. Every detail, from the way her books were stacked by height to the exact time she brewed her morning coffee, seemed deliberate, part of a larger equation of control. To outsiders, her life looked like a calm, balanced system. But beneath that order lay a restless energy that refused to be idle. Jaime was born in 1977, in the sun-drenched suburbs of Southern California, where neat lawns and quiet evenings gave the illusion of simplicity. Her parents, both educators, believed that discipline and integrity were the foundation of a good life. They taught their daughter to respect knowledge and hard work above everything else. Family gatherings were filled with discussions about history, science, and ethics, never gossip or idle talk. Even as a child, Jaime listened more than she spoke. Her relatives would later recall that she seemed to be constantly observing the world, quietly analyzing every gesture and tone, as if she were collecting data rather than merely living. While most children were busy building sandcastles or running through sprinklers, Jaime preferred the quiet of her room, where she could read for hours without interruption. She found comfort in the predictability of numbers and the clean logic of equations. Dolls and games didn't appeal to her. She wanted structure, purpose, and direction. By the age of 12, she was keeping a small notebook where she listed her goals for the next 10 years. It wasn't a childish fantasy list. It was a plan, a contract with herself. She wrote, "I will not depend on anyone. I will create my own life." At school, Jaime was more than a good student. She was exceptional. Her teachers spoke of her as the kind of pupil every educator hopes for: diligent, exact, and endlessly curious. She excelled in the exact sciences, solving complex mathematical problems long before her peers could even grasp the formulas. In chemistry, she memorized reactions like others memorized song lyrics. In biology, she treated the human body as a perfectly balanced system, predictable, logical, and therefore fascinating. Her analytical thinking was almost mechanical, but not cold. She saw beauty in order. Her guiding belief was simple: if there is a system, there will be a result. And yet, Jaime was never boastful. She didn't need to be. Confidence for her was a quiet certainty, not something to display. Even in her teenage years, when others sought attention or affection, she remained focused on her long-term path. Friends came and went, but her commitment to self-discipline stayed unshaken. She began working part-time as soon as she was legally allowed to. Not because her family needed the money, but because she wanted to experience independence. Every paycheck, no matter how small, was proof that she could rely on herself. After graduating from high school with honors, Jaime moved across the country to attend the University of Michigan, one of the most respected academic institutions in the nation. There, she immersed herself in studies related to science and medicine, subjects that demanded precision, patience, and reason. In her second year, she found her calling in biomedical sales, a field that perfectly matched her skills. It combined science with structure, intellect with communication, logic with measurable results. For Jaime, it wasn't just a career, it was a strategy for stability. Her colleagues later described her as the embodiment of professionalism. She arrived early to meetings, her notes already color-coded and cross-checked. She never missed a deadline, never raised her voice, and never allowed emotions to cloud her judgment. To her coworkers, she was polite but distant, the type of person who remembered every detail about a project but never revealed anything about her own life. She had an uncanny ability to listen without ever truly exposing herself. In group photos, Jaime was always the one slightly turned to the side, smiling gently, but with an expression that suggested she was already thinking about her next task. Reliable, composed, meticulous, her manager once wrote in a performance review. Yet there was always the same quiet postscript. Difficult to know. Outside of work, her life was no less structured. Her home in Arizona was a reflection of her inner world. Spotless, symmetrical, every object in its exact place. The refrigerator was organized by color and expiration date. Her calendar was filled weeks in advance. Gym at 6, yoga at 8, groceries on Thursdays, cleaning on Saturdays. She never left things to chance. Spontaneity was, in her view, just another word for disorder. Neighbors sometimes wondered about her. She greeted them warmly but briefly, never inviting conversation to go deeper. Few ever stepped inside her house. She lived alone, but there was nothing lonely about her solitude. She seemed to prefer it, as if the quiet was not emptiness, but a necessary space for thought. Jaime Jean Liati felt safe when she was alone. Solitude for her was not emptiness, but clarity. A quiet space where every thought could be arranged in perfect order. In that silence, she could breathe, think, and regain balance. While others sought constant communication, Jaime found peace in the rhythm of her own routine. Her family, especially her father and stepmother, remained an important part of her life, though their closeness was carefully measured. They called each other regularly, exchanged polite updates, and occasionally met for holidays. Yet there was always a certain distance, as if invisible glass separated them. This separation wasn't born from coldness or resentment. It was a form of protection. Jaime respected her family deeply, but preferred emotional caution to unnecessary vulnerability. She had learned early that trust was a gift to be given sparingly. Jaime's independence was more than a lifestyle. It was her identity. She handled her finances with precision. A spotless credit history, a steady and well-paid job, a mortgage paid on time, and a car maintained to perfection. She asked for nothing, borrowed from no one, and faced life without complaint. To an outside observer, her existence appeared ideal, stable, structured, and free of turbulence. Her days moved like clockwork, predictable but satisfying. There was no chaos, no risk, and certainly no dependence on others. It was, as she often said to herself, exactly the life I built and exactly the life I wanted. Yet behind the walls of this measured order, small traces of something softer occasionally appeared. Fleeting signs of loneliness that even she couldn't completely disguise. Her notebooks, usually filled with work goals and schedules, began to include small personal reflections. Short sentences about connection, about trust, about the difficulty of letting people in. In her online shopping history, there appeared titles like The Art of Emotional Openness and How to Build Healthy Boundaries Without Isolation. She subscribed to self-development podcasts, took brief online therapy sessions, and filled her evenings with courses on mindfulness. All these actions might have looked like part of her disciplined nature, another project, another checklist. But in truth, they hinted at a quiet longing. Somewhere inside, Jaime wanted to learn how to be close to others without losing the balance she so carefully maintained. She wanted to believe that intimacy didn't have to mean chaos, that letting someone into her world didn't have to dismantle the system that kept her grounded. Still, her fear of losing control outweighed her desire to take that risk. To her, emotional unpredictability was dangerous, a variable she could never fully calculate. So she stayed where she felt safest, inside her own structure, inside her solitude. Jaime never wanted attention. She didn't maintain active social media accounts. Her digital footprint was minimal, almost invisible. She shared no personal photos, made no posts about success, and kept her private life exactly that, private. Her satisfaction didn't depend on approval or applause. What mattered was the inner sense of comfort, of being at peace within her own order. By all outward measures, Jaime Liati was a woman entirely in control. But life often hides its most fragile people behind masks of strength. Those who rarely show pain, who manage everything alone, who never ask for help, they are the ones who carry the heaviest burdens. By that time, Jaime was just past 30. She had achieved everything most people only dream about: independence, a respected career, and a home of her own in the quiet neighborhoods of Chandler, Arizona. Her life seemed perfectly designed, steady, calm, free from conflict. She was the image of success without noise. In early 2010, nothing outwardly had changed. Her schedule was as strict as ever. early morning runs through quiet desert streets, neatly timed work calls, client meetings planned to the minute, and yoga sessions that ended precisely at 8:30. Her neighbors saw her come and go with the same calm efficiency every day. Her coworkers continued to describe her as composed, responsible, and polite. The kind of person who never lost her temper and never made excuses. But underneath that familiar calm, subtle changes had begun to appear. They were small enough to overlook, a missed message here, a delayed reply there. But for those who knew Jaime, they carried weight. She started answering her family's calls less frequently. Conversations that used to last 20 minutes became brief check-ins, her tone more distant, her laughter less frequent. Her father noticed it first. "She sounds tired," he told her stepmother one evening. Not sad, just somewhere else. Weeks passed, and the pattern continued. Emails went unanswered. Texts received polite but delayed replies. By late February, the correspondence had grown noticeably dry, factual, without warmth. Her father tried to convince himself it was just work stress, another busy quarter. But when March arrived and communication nearly stopped, a quiet concern began to settle in. On March 18th, 2010, the morning after St. Patrick's Day, when most people were still sharing photos of parades and green decorations, the world around Jaime Jean Liatti simply went quiet. It was as if she had stepped out of her own carefully arranged life and left no sign she had ever been there. That Thursday began like any other in her company's Arizona office. The staff gathered for the regular morning meeting, coffee cups in hand, laptops open, waiting for Jaime, who was usually the first to arrive and the last to leave. Her chair remained empty. At first, no one paid much attention. People assumed she might be running late, perhaps caught in traffic or taking a well-deserved morning off. But as the hours passed and no message arrived, curiosity turned to mild concern. By midday, her manager checked the calendar. There was no vacation request, no medical leave notice, no out-of-office email. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Texts remained unread. For someone as disciplined as Jaime, this was not merely unusual. It was unthinkable. That evening, a few colleagues exchanged puzzled messages. One said, "Maybe she's sick." Another added, "Jaime doesn't get sick. She'd still email from the hospital." What began as confusion slowly thickened into unease. The next day brought no updates. Then another. Soon a full week had passed with no contact, no explanation, no trace of where she might have gone. Her work laptop sat untouched on her office desk. Reports that she had been preparing were left unfinished. Something that had never happened before. It was as though a system that had always run with perfect precision had suddenly stopped without warning. At her quiet suburban home in Chandler, the first tangible sign of something amiss appeared. Her car, which neighbors were used to seeing neatly parked in the driveway, was gone. Those same neighbors, though not close to her, noticed that the house stayed dark in the evenings. The mail began to pile up. The newspaper delivery man mentioned that no one had picked up the last few issues. Jaime's father and stepmother, still in California, began calling more frequently. Each time, the phone rang unanswered. They left messages that grew gradually more anxious. First polite check-ins, then gentle pleas for her to call back. They reached out to her coworkers, to friends from college, even to her gym. No one had seen or heard from her. What had once been a perfectly predictable routine had turned into a void. Several days later, a new figure entered the picture. A man who introduced himself as Brian Stewart, claiming to be Jaime's boyfriend. He told her parents that there was no need for alarm. According to him, Jaime had made a sudden decision to leave for Denver, Colorado. She wanted, he said, a new beginning, a change of scenery, a clean break. He described their relationship as recently ended but amicable, insisting that she had gone willingly and that she was fine. On the surface, his explanation might have sounded plausible. People move, lives shift. But to those who knew Jaime, the story simply didn't fit. She was many things. Organized, rational, deliberate, but never impulsive. She didn't make life-altering choices overnight. and she certainly didn't vanish without a plan. The inconsistencies grew more troubling the closer her family looked. If Jaime had truly planned to relocate, why had she left behind nearly everything she owned? Her closet was still full. Her laptop sat on the desk beside her unopened planner. Important documents, her passport, tax records, even her birth certificate, were untouched in their folders. There was food in the refrigerator, a laundry load half done, and a yoga mat still unrolled in the corner of her living room. Even her small daily habits told a story that didn't align with voluntary departure. Jaime had a habit of recording every expense. She checked her accounts almost obsessively. Yet in the days following her disappearance, her bank cards went silent. No withdrawals, no payments, no signs of activity. The pattern of order that defined her life had stopped at once. Like a machine unplugged mid-operation. Still, Brian Stewart continued to insist that everything was fine. In phone calls with the family, he repeated the same lines. She just needs some space. She's starting over. She wants to be alone for a while. His calm tone contrasted sharply with the family's growing panic, and yet his explanations remained vague. No phone number in Denver, no address, no confirmation of travel tickets. Jaime's parents wanted to believe him. They told themselves that maybe she really had needed a break, that perhaps years of strict control had finally exhausted her. But deep down, that hope felt thin. Their daughter was not a person who vanished without a trace. She planned every step, every movement, every expense. This silence was not a choice. It was a warning. However, the police received a missing persons report only 2 months later, in May 2010. All this time, the relatives tried to believe in the best. They tried to convince themselves that Jaime, as always, had simply closed herself off from the world and would soon get in touch. But the longer the silence lasted, the clearer it became. Something irreparable had happened. The Chandler police began an investigation, and the first task was to talk to Brian Stewart, the person who was closest to her. What the detectives found out in the first days was a shock. The identity of the man who called himself Brian did not exist. There was no diploma from the University of Michigan, not a single legal document in his name. It turned out that he used fake documents, a fake social security number, and many other identities in the past. His real name was Rick Valentini, and behind him was a trail of scams, lies, unregistered marriages, and debts. But proving he was involved in Jaime's disappearance wasn't easy. There was no sign of a struggle in the house. No blood, no weapon, no body. No evidence that a crime had even been committed. But detectives dug deeper. They discovered that Valentini had continued to use her car after she disappeared. He had also tried to access her bank accounts. Several witnesses claimed to have seen him driving her car. One, a mechanic at a car service station, said Brian had come in for an oil change and said the car belonged to his ex, whom he had just broken up with. It all fit together disturbingly. When he was arrested on a minor traffic violation, detectives raided his home. They found false papers, multiple fake IDs, fake documents, and electronic devices. But no direct evidence linking him to Jaime's disappearance was ever found. Meanwhile, he continued to insist, "I didn't do anything. She left on her own. I have no idea where she is." Months passed. The investigation stalled. No body, no evidence, no charges. Jaime's family was in agony. In the eyes of the law, she was considered missing, not a victim of a crime. But her father's heart told him otherwise. His daughter couldn't just disappear. Not her. Not like that. More than 8 years passed. The world around her changed. People moved, new stores opened, generations of school children changed. And Jaime's name gradually disappeared from the news. But those who knew her did not forget. It was thanks to their persistence that the case was not closed. And in June 2018, something happened that few believed in. On a plot of land in the Sun Lakes area where landscaping was underway, workers stumbled upon evidence. The police were called. An examination was carried out. A few weeks later, DNA analysis confirmed. This was Jaime Jean Liaddi. The one who left so quietly was finally found. When DNA testing in 2018 confirmed the evidence found in Sun Lakes as those of Jaime Jean Liadi, it was both a turning point for investigators and a brutal reminder of how many years it had taken to find the obvious. At that point, the case officially became a criminal investigation, a death investigation. Up until then, it had been all about guesswork, circumstantial evidence, and intuition. Now there was a victim. There was a crime scene, even if it had been partially destroyed by time, which meant it was time to put the pieces back together. Only now they weren't looking for a missing woman. They were looking for a killer. Chandler police and Maricopa County detectives spent the first weeks after the body's discovery carefully examining the DNA. All of this was sent to the lab for analysis. Particular attention was drawn to the marks on the wrists. This was difficult to confirm, but such marks could not be ignored. There was no jewelry or personal belongings on the body, no watch, no phone, no keys. Anything that could identify the victim had been removed. It looked like a deliberate cleansing. However, one piece of evidence. Among the clothing fragments, a torn tag was found with the inscription of a brand of women's sportswear, the same brand that Jaime wore. Her father would later confirm that the shirt could have belonged to his daughter. The forensic examination lasted for several weeks. Specialists from the Maricopa County Laboratory reconstructed the skull, compared the bone structure, conducted a genetic analysis and dental identification. Samples previously provided by Jaime's family were used for DNA comparison. The match was 100%. In June 2018, police officially confirmed that the DNA found under a gravel embankment in Sun Lakes belonged to Jaime Jean Liadi, a woman who had disappeared 8 years earlier. It was an emotional blow to the family. On the one hand, they finally had an answer. On the other, this answer was final, irrevocable. It was not a disappearance. It was a crime. The investigation again returned to the figure who had raised doubts from the very beginning. Rick Valentini, the man Jaime knew as Brian Stewart. With the fact of the girl's death now proven, the investigators could make more compelling claims. The painstaking work began. Analyzing all the materials collected earlier, checking his movements, calls, purchases, electronic traces. Everything that had previously seemed indirect and weak acquired significance in the new context. First of all, the investigators analyzed reports on Jaime's mobile activity. The last time he logged on was March 17, 2010. After that, complete silence. The phone was turned off, and the SIM card was destroyed. This was in sharp contrast to Valentini's behavior. His phone, on the contrary, showed activity on the same days, and in the very area where the remains were later found. Coincidence? Possibly. But this was only one of dozens of fragments that began to form a general picture. In parallel, an analysis of financial transactions began. After Jaime's disappearance, someone tried to use her credit cards, including at a gas station located 2 miles from the future location of the discovery. CCTV footage showed a man who looked like Valentini inserting a card into the terminal and quickly walking away. The footage was added to the case. Witnesses played a key role. Those who saw Valentini in Jaime's car in 2010. Among them were a mechanic, a neighbor, a supermarket employee. All of them confirmed that after Jaime's disappearance, her car was driven by some man. Some claimed that he introduced himself as her ex. One of them even noticed a woman's bag and jacket in the back seat. The totality of the testimonies, although not having any weight as direct evidence, formed a psychological portrait of a person who tried to pass off someone else's as his own and behaved as if Jaime had simply ceased to be a part of his world. Details from Valentini's own past also surfaced. He had no authentic documents. His so-called biography, a graduate of the University of Michigan, a former engineer, an IT specialist, turned out to be fiction. A check through the databases showed that a person with such a name never studied at the university, did not work in the declared companies, and had no registered income. On the contrary, he had fines, arrests, and lawsuits for fraud in several states. He was a master of disguise. He used dozens of fake names, fake IDs, and played roles with the precision of an actor. He could be anyone except himself. Investigators were particularly interested in the lease of the land where the body was found. Archived data showed that the company that was in charge of the land had been hiring workers temporarily without checking or recording. In 2010, seasonal work was being carried out there, and among the workers was a man who registered under the fake name that Valentini had previously used. This was a breakthrough. Although the evidence was indirect, it indicated that a man posing as Brian had access to the place where Jaime was later found, at the very time she disappeared. Valentini's correspondence in emails and instant messages was also examined. Some of the messages written in her name were sent from IP addresses that matched his apartment. The text of the messages was unusual for Jaime. Short, cold, as if they were written by someone unfamiliar with her communication style. This indicated an attempt to create the appearance that she was still in touch. Linguistic experts confirmed that the structure of these messages was different from those Jaime had sent before. When investigators questioned him again, Valentini continued to insist. He did not know where Jaime was. He claimed that they had broken up, that she had left, that he had never seen her again. But the pressure from the evidence was mounting. A picture was emerging. The man who had lived under the same roof with her was leading a double life, using her property after she disappeared, lying about her whereabouts, and had previously been caught in a series of deceptions. One thing was missing: direct evidence. And then, years later, the police turned to forensic investigators who specialize in reconstructing digital and physical events. A timeline was created, where Valentini was on the day Jaime disappeared, what devices were used, how the signals moved, what transactions were conducted with her finances, and how it all related to where the body was found. The model was compelling. It didn't say, "Here's the proof," but it showed. In this entire story, only one person knew where to look for Jaime, and only one had the motive, access, and expertise to cover up the crime. The investigation now had a solid foundation. The circumstances of the death, the evidence, the testimony, the digital footprints, the fake identity, all pointed to Valentini. That was enough to move on to the next step: filing charges. After 8 years of uncertainty, cold feet, and silence, the truth was beginning to break through the lies. The evidence was collected. And while none of it was conclusive on its own, taken together, it painted a clear, grim picture. Jaime Liaddi's name was back in the headlines, this time in the district attorney's office's briefings. In November 2011, before her had even been found, the Arizona State Attorney's Office took the unprecedented step of charging Rick Valentini, aka Brian Stewart, with the murder of Jaime Jean Liaddi, even though her body had never been found. It was one of the few cases in the state's history to bring a murder charge without a body. The decision was made possible by the meticulous work of investigators and prosecutors. They convinced the court that the combination of digital evidence, eyewitness testimony, false alibis, financial manipulation, and the defendant's personal history was enough to proceed with a trial. The main charge was first-degree murder. Valentini was also charged with fraud, using forged documents, misappropriation of property, and obstructing an investigation. The trial began in the spring of 2013 in the Maricopa County Superior Courthouse, in a packed courtroom that included journalists, Jaime's former colleagues, and her family. In the dock sat a man who once introduced himself as a caring partner, but turned out to be a skilled liar with many fictitious lives behind him. At the trial, he no longer denied using forged documents. He admitted that he pretended to be a university graduate, that he lived under a false name. But he denied murder to the end. After 8 long years of uncertainty and endless requests, in the summer of 2018, the investigation finally had what was missing from the very beginning: the DNA of Jaime Liaddi. It was this discovery that allowed the Arizona District Attorney's Office to re-examine the case and reopen it not as a missing person, but as a murder with proven fact of death. The accusation, which had been formulated earlier, gained new life. The prosecution built its case on a series of escalating incidents. Witnesses, a mechanic, a neighbor, bank employees, former colleagues of Jaime's, described the suspect as a man who tried to move on with his life after the girl's disappearance, as if nothing had happened. Testimony from experts on mobile activity indicated that both Jaime's and Valentini's phones were in the same area on the night of her disappearance. Analysis of bank activity confirmed attempts to withdraw money from her account after she stopped responding. The culmination was a forensic report. The place where it was found coincided with the territory that Valentini had access to in 2010 under an assumed name, while working on a temporary basis. The defense, however, relied on the lack of direct evidence. They argued that Jaime could have left voluntarily, and that her disappearance was not necessarily connected to Valentini. They emphasized that the crime was not recorded immediately, that the body was not found until 2018, and that the evidence, in their opinion, was circumstantial and emotionally charged. However, during cross-examination, the defense repeatedly stumbled. Valentini's explanations changed, the chronology did not match, and the testimony was confused. The jury saw before them not just an accused, but a person who systematically lived a lie. Expert linguistic examination played a special role. Prosecutors presented letters sent on behalf of Jaime after her disappearance and compared them with the real texts that she wrote during her lifetime. The differences were striking. The grammatical structure, vocabulary, even typical turns of speech were different. This strengthened the suspicion that the letters were forged, in order to imitate that Jaime was still alive. The trial lasted almost 6 weeks. All the testimony, materials, evidence lined up in one chain. This was not a case of a random outburst of rage. This was a case of control, manipulation, and an attempt to erase someone from existence so he could live under an assumed name. Valentini didn't just kill, he tried to make it look like Jaime never existed. The jury deliberated for less than 8 hours on sentencing day. Their verdict was unanimous: guilty. Rick Valentini was found guilty of first-degree murder, as well as fraud and using a forged document. The judge, addressing the defendant, emphasized, "Your actions were calculated, cold-blooded, and devoid of any compassion. You robbed a young woman of her life and her family of hope." Rick Valentini was given the maximum possible sentence of 54 years in prison, with no chance of parole. The sentence became a symbol of justice achieved even in places where there was no body, no eyewitnesses, and no confession for a long time. Jaime Jean Liaddi has finally found her voice, not through words, but through the inexorable force of facts. David and Sherry decided to stop by Brad's house one quiet afternoon. The plan was simple: a quick chat, maybe some coffee. When they pulled up to the driveway, Brad's car was there, parked neatly by the curb. Everything seemed normal at first glance. Yet, something felt off. The curtains were drawn, and not a single sound came from inside. They knocked on the front door. Once, twice, 3 times. No answer. "Brad?" David called out, raising his voice slightly. Silence. Sherry frowned. "That's strange. He said he'd be home all day." Sherry suggested they check around the back, just in case. As they turned the corner, she noticed the service door was open a few inches. Brad never left it like that. Cautiously, he pushed the door open. Sherry moved upstairs, calling Brad's name in a trembling voice while David headed down the narrow stairs to the basement. Each step creaked beneath his feet. His heart pounded louder with every descent. And then, as he reached the bottom, he froze. The sight before him made the world fall silent. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. David Kenny was an ordinary young man, the kind you might pass on the street without realizing how much warmth and hope lived behind his easy smile. At 21, he stood on the threshold of adulthood. When his birthday arrived, his mother decided to celebrate it in a way that would mark the beginning of his adult life. A grand gathering filled with music, laughter, and family. That evening, their modest home in Cambridge, Ohio, was alive with joy. Among the many guests that night was Sherry, a graceful woman in her late 20s, attending the celebration with her young son. Sherry was known in the neighborhood for her gentle nature and resilience. A single mother who worked tirelessly to build a safe and happy home for her 3 children. As the night unfolded, David couldn't help but notice her. Something about Sherry, perhaps her quiet laughter or the kindness in her eyes, struck a deep chord within him. The next morning, unable to keep his excitement contained, David told his mother that he had met someone special. His words were filled with sincerity. "Mom, I think I found the woman I want to spend my life with." Not everyone shared David's enthusiasm. Some of his friends, and even a few relatives, questioned his readiness to take on such a serious commitment, especially to a woman with 3 children. "You're too young," they warned. "It's a heavy responsibility." But David wasn't a man easily swayed by others' doubts. Determined to provide for his new family, David decided to pursue a career that would offer stability and good pay. He enrolled in a training program to become a coal miner, a job known for its physical hardship but also for its steady income. It was there, during those long training sessions underground and in the classrooms above, that David met a man who would later play a pivotal role in his life: Brad McGarry. Brad's story was one of resilience. Born in the 1970s in Cambridge, he grew up in a conservative environment that wasn't always kind to those who stood out. From a young age, Brad had been open about who he was, but his honesty came with challenges. He endured hurtful words, exclusion, and judgment from people who couldn't understand him. Yet, through it all, he carried himself with dignity. His courage inspired many, and his humor often softened even the hardest of hearts. Before entering the mines, Brad had worked as a hairstylist, a career that allowed him to express creativity and connect with others. In a small working-class town, it wasn't always easy to make a living in that line of work, but Brad had built a loyal group of clients who appreciated not just his skill, but his vibrant spirit. Eventually, seeking a more secure income and perhaps a change of pace, Brad decided to shift careers entirely. That decision brought him into David's world. From the moment they met, the two formed a strong bond. David admired Brad's optimism and resilience. Brad, in turn, respected David's integrity and kindness. Over time, Brad became part of the Kenny family's inner circle. Sherry adored him, and the children affectionately called him Uncle Brad. He joined them for Sunday dinners, birthdays, and summer barbecues, always bringing laughter and warmth wherever he went. The Kenny home became his second family. By 2017, David was 30 years old, settled into family life with Sherry, and proud of how far they had come together. Their children were growing fast, each carving their own little personalities. Brad, meanwhile, seemed content, balancing his work, his friendships, and a romantic relationship that he kept mostly private. Still, close friends noticed that at times he appeared preoccupied, perhaps burdened by something he didn't quite share. On the afternoon of May 7th, 2017, a Sunday filled with sunshine and soft winds, Brad attended a small family gathering. Those who saw him said he seemed relaxed, even cheerful. As he prepared to leave, he mentioned to his cousin that he had an appointment later that evening and needed to head home. It was the last time anyone saw him alive. Later that evening, around 6:15 p.m., David, Sherry, and their youngest daughter decided to drop by Brad's house. They had planned to discuss details for an upcoming summer trip to the Bahamas, a vacation all of them had been eagerly anticipating. When they arrived, they noticed Brad's car parked outside, but there was no sign of movement inside. They knocked several times. No answer. They called his name. Silence. Concerned, Sherry suggested checking around the back. The service door was slightly ajar, something Brad never did. David felt an uneasy chill in his chest as he called out again, "Brad, it's us!" Still no reply. Taking a cautious step forward, he entered the house. The air inside was still, heavy with a quiet that felt wrong. Upstairs, Sherry checked the rooms while David moved toward the basement. When he descended those steps, the scene that met his eyes would haunt him forever. The stillness, the unnatural quiet, and then the sight that confirmed their worst fears. Brad was gone. Sherry, hearing David's shaken voice, rushed downstairs. Her reaction was instant, a mixture of disbelief and grief. She quickly reached for her phone and dialed 911, her voice trembling as she reported what they had found. Within minutes, police officers and emergency responders arrived, filling the quiet street with flashing lights and hushed urgency. David and Sherry stood together, devastated as they gave their statements. They spoke openly about their friendship with Brad, about the years of laughter, loyalty, and shared memories. Their daughter clung to Sherry's arm, confused and frightened by the commotion. Investigators noted the deep emotional connection the family had with Brad. When asked if Brad had any problems or conflicts recently, David mentioned that Brad had been involved in a turbulent relationship with a man named Scotty. Though they didn't know his full name, both David and Sherry recalled that the relationship had been strained, marked by frequent arguments and emotional ups and downs. Still, none of them imagined that anything truly dangerous could come from it. As investigators examined the basement and surrounding area, they documented every detail carefully. Out of respect, details about Brad's condition were not shared publicly, but officers quietly discussed several possibilities. Initially, they considered the idea that Brad might have been struggling personally, a thought that brought sorrow rather than suspicion. The lead forensic expert, a seasoned man named Dr. Leonard Hayes, stepped carefully into the basement, his trained eyes scanning every inch of the scene. "Did anyone locate a weapon?" he asked the officers quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority of experience. One of the younger patrolmen shook his head. "No weapon found, sir." "We've checked every room." Dr. Hayes crouched beside the scene, his gloved hands hovering just above the surface of the floor as he examined subtle traces. Footprints, faint scuff marks, the disarray of nearby objects. After a few moments, he stood up and turned to the detective in charge. "There's no weapon," he said firmly. "We can rule out the idea of this being self-inflicted." That single statement shifted the entire tone of the investigation. What had once seemed like a possible act of despair now looked far more sinister. As the evening wore on, investigators moved systematically through Brad's home. Each room told a story, though the story seemed deliberately distorted. The kitchen was a mess. Several drawers left open, a few plates shattered on the tiled floor, as if someone had searched through them in a hurry. The living room was equally chaotic, with cushions thrown aside and picture frames slightly askew. At first glance, it looked like a robbery gone wrong. But something about it didn't add up. Detective Miriam Clark, one of the department's most meticulous investigators, noticed it first. "If this was a robbery," she murmured to her partner, "why leave the TV untouched? And look at this. There's money on the floor." Actual bills. Her partner, Detective Ruiz, crouched down beside the coffee table, inspecting the scene more closely. "And not just small change," he added. "Whoever did this wasn't looking for cash." Brad's home, though modest, reflected his personality. Warm colors, neatly arranged books, and walls adorned with rustic, rural-style paintings. He was an art enthusiast who collected pieces from local fairs and independent artists. Many of them held real value. The detectives couldn't ignore the fact that not a single artwork had been taken. "This was staged," Clark concluded. "They wanted us to think it was a break-in, but it's a performance." Someone tried too hard. With the robbery theory fading, investigators turned their focus to Brad's personal life. Being openly gay in a traditional mining town had never been easy, and the detectives briefly entertained the possibility that his death could have been motivated by prejudice. But when they interviewed his colleagues at the coal mine, they encountered a different picture. "Brad was one of the good ones," said one of the miners, wiping coal dust from his hands as he spoke to the officers. "Didn't matter who he was or what he liked. He worked hard, never caused trouble." Another coworker added, "Everyone liked him, always helped people out even when he didn't have to. If someone had an issue with him, we'd have known." The detectives left the mine puzzled but certain of one thing. Brad had been respected there. A hate-motivated attack didn't fit the evidence. The next step was to trace Brad's personal connections. Detectives revisited the earlier statements made by David and Sherry Kenny, Brad's close friends who had discovered his body. Both mentioned that Brad had recently ended a difficult relationship with a man named Scotty. Further interviews confirmed this. A woman named Wendy, one of Brad's closest friends, shared her concerns during questioning. "I never trusted Scotty," she said, her tone protective. "Brad was so full of light before he met him. But that man, he drained him. It was always drama, arguments, jealousy, disappearing acts. I begged Brad to walk away." Detectives leaned in. And did he? He did, finally, Wendy replied, her eyes glistening. A few weeks ago, but it wasn't easy. He told me Scotty didn't take it well. With this, Scotty became the next name on the list. Detectives managed to obtain his full name and address and immediately drove out to his residence. The visit, however, brought an unexpected twist. A tired-looking woman opened the door. Scotty's mother. Her expression darkened when she heard Brad's name. "Scotty's not here," she said. "He's been in jail for 3 months. Violation of probation. You can check the records if you want." Detectives exchanged glances. The news seemed to clear Scotty, at least physically, from direct involvement. Yet, given the nature of the case, they couldn't entirely dismiss him. It wasn't impossible for someone behind bars to arrange something beyond those walls. A few days later, Detectives Clark and Ruiz arranged a meeting with Scotty at the county detention center. Sitting across from them, Scotty appeared thinner than in his mugshot, his nervous energy evident as he wrung his hands together. When they informed him about Brad's death, the color drained from his face. No, that can't be right," he whispered. "Brad? He was fine the last time we talked." Clark watched closely, measuring every flicker of emotion. "When was that?" "Before I came in here," Scotty replied softly. "He told me he was seeing someone new. I was upset, sure, but I'd never hurt him. I swear to you, detective." By the end of the interview, the detectives were inclined to believe him. Scotty's grief appeared genuine, his surprise unfeigned. Still, they left the jail with more questions than answers. Desperate for leads, the investigators turned their attention to the neighborhood. They canvassed nearby homes, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual on the evening of May 7th. Finally, a small glimmer of hope appeared. A neighbor across the street had a security camera aimed directly toward Brad's driveway. The footage became a crucial piece of evidence. Detectives gathered several hours' worth of recordings, beginning from early afternoon until late that night. They began reviewing it frame by frame, looking for any unfamiliar vehicles or unexpected visitors. Meanwhile, interviews with Brad's friends and relatives continued. Most offered heartfelt stories of a man who loved deeply and cared for those around him. But one particular conversation changed everything. 2 days later, detectives met with one of Brad's cousins, a soft-spoken man named Trevor. He recalled seeing Brad earlier that very day at a family lunch. "He was in good spirits," Trevor said. "We all laughed a lot. He left around, I'd say, maybe 1:30, 2 p.m. Said he had company coming later." Clark asked gently, "Did he say who?" Trevor hesitated. "Yeah, he said a guy named DJ was coming over. He kind of joked about it, said they were going to take a nap, if you know what I mean." The detectives exchanged knowing looks, but stayed professional. Trevor continued, lowering his voice. "Brad told me the guy was married. Said he hadn't told his wife about the relationship. Apparently, it had been going on for years, on and off. They kept it quiet. Real quiet." Detective Ruiz leaned forward. "Did Brad tell you DJ's full name?" Trevor sighed. "At first, I didn't want to say. It's not my business to ruin someone's life, but you've got to understand. Brad was family. So, if this helps..." He looked up at them, his face filled with reluctant resolve. "DJ isn't just anyone. He's someone you'd recognize." The name he spoke next sent a ripple of shock through the investigation room. A revelation that would steer the entire case in a new, unexpected direction. When the officer heard the name, he froze in disbelief. David Kenny. The same David who had stood trembling in Brad's basement, who had called for help. The officer paused, visibly trying to process the revelation. For a moment, the room felt suspended in silence. He asked the cousin again, carefully, almost hoping to hear a different answer. "Are you absolutely sure? You're saying DJ is David Kenny?" The cousin nodded firmly and repeated that David was the only man Brad had ever mentioned romantically to him, and that Brad had hinted about their secret meetings many times in confidence. The detectives, upon hearing this name, exchanged glances filled with sudden understanding. A puzzle that had been blurred until now suddenly snapped into sharp focus. Until that moment, David had been seen as a grieving friend, a supportive visitor who had stumbled into a terrible situation. He had been a cooperative witness, someone who appeared heartbroken and shaken. But now, in a sudden and dramatic shift, he transformed from sympathetic witness to the prime suspect in Brad's death. The investigators later confessed that once the connection was made, many confusing details of the case suddenly aligned into a chilling pattern. With a new urgency, the detectives began examining David's behavior from the very beginning. The emotional tremble in his voice, the shock in his eyes. Now they questioned whether it had been genuine grief or staged reaction. Their suspicions deepened quickly. Under a polite and seemingly routine request, they asked David to hand over his phone, explaining that they needed to retrieve photographs he had taken the night he found Brad. David, not yet aware that the investigation had shifted toward him, willingly unlocked his phone and handed it over. Yet what detectives truly sought was not photographs, but precise location data. Proof of where David had been at the time Brad lost his life, and whether he had been in contact with Brad in a manner that went beyond friendship. As digital investigators combed through the device, they found location coordinates placing David at Brad's house exactly during the critical time frame. While David had attempted to cover his tracks by deleting messages, specialized forensic software recovered fragments of text conversations. These uncovered exchanges, subtle, fond messages mixed with emotional tension, confirmed what Brad's cousin had said. David and Brad were involved. Their relationship was real. At the same time, detectives reviewing the neighbor's surveillance footage found visual confirmation. The recording clearly showed David arriving at Brad's house earlier that day. Strikingly, he had not driven his own vehicle. Instead, he arrived in Sherry's car, suggesting an intention to avoid being recognized. He stayed for roughly 40 minutes, having entered at a time consistent with the established window of the tragedy. The same footage later showed him returning hours afterward with his family, arriving in his personal truck as though nothing unusual had occurred. During that second visit, he appeared calm, presenting the trip as an innocent stop to deliver a yard tool Brad had supposedly asked for. The evidence kept layering itself neatly, forming a portrait investigators could no longer ignore. Every new discovery tightened the circle around David. Once enough proof had been gathered, detectives called him in for questioning. Now not as a witness, but as a suspect. When confronted with his phone data, surveillance footage, and recovered messages, David initially tried to maintain composure. He acknowledged being at the house earlier, but began quickly altering his story, shifting details, adjusting timelines. Across the interrogation, he offered as many as 7 or 8 versions of what happened, each inconsistent with the last. One explanation involved an unnamed third man. He claimed that another individual had been there, someone who confronted him and threatened him into silence. Detectives listened patiently, but trained instinct told them the account lacked credibility. The story kept changing, details grew contradictory, and emotional cues in his voice began to sound more like desperation than truth. Eventually, cornered by overwhelming facts, David admitted to hiding his relationship from his wife. However, he insisted that the romance had only lasted a short time, just months, and denied any long-term emotional attachment. He stated that during his visit, he had attempted to break things off with Brad, leading to a heated argument. According to his version, Brad became upset and the situation escalated. Yet when detectives challenged him with physical and timeline evidence, they pointed out that the scenario he described defied basic logic and physical circumstances of the scene. When questioned about the missing weapon, David said that he had thrown it away while leaving the property, claiming panic and emotional distress. Officers searched extensively in the surrounding area over the following days, combing through brush and wooded terrain, but no weapon was ever recovered. Despite this missing piece, investigators felt confident their case was strong. They believed motive, presence, digital proof, and behavior together formed an undeniable chain. Before David was taken to jail, detectives allowed him a brief, supervised moment to speak with his wife, Sherry. The room was quiet, the weight of betrayal and shock hanging heavily in the air. David, now visibly drained, confessed to his wife about the hidden relationship and expressed remorse, saying he wished he had handled his life differently and admitting he could not undo what had been done. He repeated the version he had offered detectives, speaking softly as if hoping to soften the impact. Sherry's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. Her eyes filled with tears and confusion mixed with disbelief. She asked whether he was making a cruel joke, unable to process the idea that the man she trusted had lived a secret life. Her voice trembled as she said she could not even look at him. It was a moment of raw human devastation, a family shattering in real time. Detectives, watching carefully, could see that Sherry's reaction was authentic. She showed nothing that suggested awareness of her husband's secret or of the events that had occurred. On the morning of May 9th, 2017, the quiet town of Cambridge, Ohio, awoke to startling news. David Kenny, a man once regarded as a devoted husband and father, had been arrested and charged with first-degree murder. After spending several tense days in custody, David finally appeared before the court for a marathon preliminary hearing in mid-May 2017. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, townspeople, and even members of both families filled every seat, their expressions a mixture of shock, sadness, and curiosity. David entered quietly, wearing the standard orange attire of an inmate, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He avoided eye contact with the spectators, keeping his gaze fixed on the floor. The judge called the session to order and the proceedings began. The prosecution opened with a detailed account of the timeline, presenting evidence that contradicted David's initial version of events. The detectives who had investigated the scene took the stand, describing how David had appeared visibly distraught when they first arrived. Pale, trembling, and short of breath, almost as though he were overwhelmed by guilt and fear. Then, the lead investigator presented David's final statement, where the narrative had shifted dramatically. This time, David admitted to pulling the trigger, but insisted it had been self-defense, a desperate act during what he described as a heated confrontation. When it was their turn, David's defense attorney rose, calm but firm. He began by reminding the court that David had never been in trouble with the law before, that he was a hardworking man, a provider, and a father to 3 children who adored him. He argued that the case was more complex than the prosecution portrayed. The defense suggested that David had acted impulsively in a moment of fear, not malice. "He is not a monster," the attorney said, looking directly at the jury. "He is a human being who found himself in an emotionally charged situation that spiraled out of control." Throughout the nearly 3-hour hearing, David sat motionless, occasionally glancing toward his family seated in the back row. His wife, Sherry, appeared pale and exhausted, her hands clasped together tightly. She hadn't spoken publicly since the arrest, but her presence suggested both loyalty and deep internal conflict. After hours of testimony, the judge finally announced his decision. There was probable cause to move the case to county court for trial. He then addressed the issue of bail, setting it at $1 million. The courtroom murmured in surprise. David's attorney immediately requested a reduction, arguing that the amount was beyond the family's means. The judge, unmoved, denied the request, citing the seriousness of the charge and the possibility of flight risk. Several weeks later, the defense team returned to court with a stack of motions, including yet another request to lower David's bail. This time, the courtroom was filled not with reporters, but with family and friends who had come to stand by David. They filled the benches, his mother, his stepfather, Sherry, and even her parents. The defense attorney spoke passionately, suggesting the bail be reduced to $250,000, an amount the Kenny family might actually afford. He argued that David had deep ties to the community, a stable home, and no prior record. Then he called witnesses to speak on David's behalf. Each testimony painted the same picture: a man who worked long hours, who loved his children, who volunteered when neighbors needed help. His mother described him as kind and generous, recalling his dedication to family and his strong sense of responsibility. Sherry took the stand, her voice trembling but steady. She told the court that David had raised her 3 children as his own for a decade, providing emotional and financial stability, and that she still believed he was not capable of deliberate violence. Despite these heartfelt appeals, the judge remained firm. "That act," the judge said, "was deceitful and calculated. It cannot be overlooked." He denied the motion, and David was returned to custody. Months later, when the trial finally began, the courtroom atmosphere was electric. For an entire week, The prosecution and defense battled to control the narrative. Forensic experts testified about digital records recovered from David's phone, reinforcing that his device had been at the scene during the time of the crime. The timeline, they said, was exact. The defense countered by emphasizing the emotional turmoil surrounding the relationship, portraying David as a man under unbearable stress. They argued that while his choices had been wrong, they stemmed from panic, not cruelty. When both sides finally rested their cases, the courtroom fell into tense silence. The jury withdrew to deliberate, and for 4 long hours, everyone waited. David sat motionless beside his attorney, his hands folded tightly, his gaze distant. Sherry sat several rows behind him, silently praying for some kind of mercy. When the jurors returned, the entire room held its breath. The judge read the verdict slowly, his voice echoing through the chamber. The jury had reached a unanimous decision. David Kenny was guilty of the aggravated murder of Brad McGarry. Before sentencing, the judge granted David the opportunity to speak. Rising slowly, David turned to face Brad's family. His voice shook, but his words were clear. "I want to say how deeply sorry I am," he began. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I wish every day that I could change what I did. Nothing I can say will bring Brad back, but I hope someday you can find it in your hearts to forgive me. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm sorry for all the pain I've caused." When he finished his emotional apology, a heavy pause filled the air. Family members from both sides wiped tears, some in anger, others in disbelief. The judge adjusted his glasses, took a deep breath, and began to speak. "Mr. Kenny," he said slowly, his tone measured and stern, "this court has listened carefully to your words. You've spoken of regret, of wishing you could undo your actions, but remorse cannot erase the truth." He paused, his eyes locking onto David's for a long, quiet moment. "Throughout this investigation and this trial, you have told lie after lie. To the police, to your wife, to your friends, and even to this courtroom. You constructed a story to protect yourself, knowing full well that another man's life had been taken. What you did was not a moment of passion. It was deliberate, planned, and followed by an elaborate attempt to deceive everyone around you." The judge then turned to the legal matter at hand. "Under Ohio law," he explained, "this court has 4 options for sentencing in a case of aggravated murder. Each involves life imprisonment, but with varying eligibility for parole. After 20 years, 25, or 30 years. The final option, of course, is life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." David's attorney rose, his tone respectful yet urgent. "Your Honor," he began, "Mr. Kenny has lived his entire life as a law-abiding citizen. He has no prior criminal record, no history of violence. What occurred that day was the product of complex emotional turmoil, not cold-hearted malice. We respectfully ask the court to consider one of the parole options, allowing him the possibility of redemption later in life." The judge leaned back, the room silent except for the faint ticking of the clock above the door. "This case," he said slowly, "is not only about what happened between 2 men, but about what it reveals in the human heart. The danger of living in deception, the cost of pride, and the destruction left in the wake of denial. Every person in the room could feel the gravity of what was about to be said." The judge removed his glasses, folded them on the bench, and delivered the ruling in a calm, final tone. "Therefore, it is the judgment of this court that you, David Kenny, shall serve a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Additionally, you will serve an extra 3 years for the firearm specification, a consequence for carrying and using a weapon during the commission of this crime." The gavel struck once. The sharp sound echoed through the courtroom like a closing door. It was the early hours of November 13th, 2016, when a call crackled through to the Orange County Emergency Dispatch Center. On the line was a man who introduced himself as Dr. Eric Scott Sills, a respected fertility specialist, his tone clipped yet curiously controlled. He told the operator he had found his wife, Suzanne, at the bottom of the staircase inside their San Clemente home. She wasn't breathing. Paramedics and deputies were dispatched immediately, unaware that what awaited them would ignite one of the most scrutinized investigations the county had seen in years. Suzanne Sills was born in the early 1970s and grew up in the United States. From a young age, she was described as energetic, intelligent, and socially engaging, a person who could light up a room with her presence while also demonstrating ambition and determination. Friends and family remember her as someone who balanced charm with a strong sense of independence, traits that would carry her into her adult life. She wasn't someone who settled for standing on the sidelines of life. By the time she reached adulthood, Suzanne had cultivated not only a natural charm, but also a sharp mind that allowed her to move with confidence in both social and professional circles. She would eventually cross paths with a man whose life was also steeped in ambition and intellect. Dr. Eric Scott Sills, a physician who specialized in reproductive medicine. Together they built a partnership that seemed, from the outside, both glamorous and successful. Yet, like many stories that appear perfect at first glance, theirs carried complexities invisible to the public eye. Suzanne was more than a doctor's wife. She was the co-founder of the Center for Advanced Genetics, a fertility clinic located in Carlsbad, California. This was not a ceremonial title bestowed on her because of her marriage. She played an active role in shaping the clinic's identity, its patient outreach, and its reputation for compassion in an emotionally charged field. Patients often entered the clinic carrying heartbreak, uncertainty, and hope in equal measure. While Eric directed the medical procedures, Suzanne became the empathetic face who could listen, reassure, and connect with those who placed their futures in the clinic's hands. She was described by colleagues as approachable and sincere, someone who seemed to carry both strength and vulnerability. This balance endeared her to people who sometimes felt like little more than statistics in the medical world. At home, life appeared charmed. The couple lived in San Clemente, a coastal city in Orange County known for its ocean views and serene neighborhoods. They were raising twins, a boy and a girl, who were just entering adolescence. To friends and neighbors, the Sills family represented stability and success. They attended school events, took part in community life, and projected an image of a family whose challenges were no greater than those faced by any busy household. Suzanne was seen as a devoted mother, deeply protective of her children and committed to giving them a safe, nurturing environment. She celebrated their achievements, worried over their setbacks, and maintained the same focus on family that she gave to the patients walking through her clinic doors. But beneath the surface, those close to Suzanne noticed signs of strain. Behind her characteristic smile, there were moments of exhaustion and frustration. She confided at times that her marriage was not as harmonious as it seemed. Eric's career consumed him, and his personality, described by some as brilliant but intense, clashed with Suzanne's need for emotional connection. Arguments were not unusual, and the pressures of running a business together added fuel to tensions that might otherwise have remained manageable. Still, Suzanne rarely allowed those struggles to define her. Instead, she poured her energy into her children, her friendships, and her work. Her ability to juggle professional and personal roles became both her strength and, as some would later argue, her burden. Her social life provided an outlet from the stresses of marriage and work. Friends recalled nights out where Suzanne's wit and charm took center stage. She could hold a room with her humor and had the rare gift of making others feel important in her presence. Yet there were hints of restlessness, moments where she seemed to want more freedom, more recognition, perhaps even more independence from the life that sometimes felt confining. This duality, the loyal mother and professional on one hand, and the woman quietly questioning her own contentment on the other, made Suzanne a deeply human figure. By her mid-40s, Suzanne was at a crossroads. Professionally, she had achieved what many would envy: a role in a successful clinic, a respected place in her community, and financial stability. Personally, however, she was wrestling with questions about her marriage, her future, and her own identity beyond the titles of wife, mother, and co-founder. While Eric's career as a fertility doctor brought him accolades and authority, Suzanne was often positioned as the supportive figure behind the scenes, even though she had helped build their shared enterprise from the ground up. For a woman as dynamic as she was, this imbalance was difficult to ignore. She took pride in presenting herself well, in being the mother at school functions who was not only present but engaged, in being the partner who stood by her husband in professional settings, and in maintaining friendships that grounded her. But just as a photograph captures only a surface image, her outward life concealed layers of conflict. Her children, then 12 years old, were the anchors in her world. Everything she did, from managing her work schedule to navigating marital disputes, was filtered through the lens of what was best for them. Suzanne was not a woman planning to abandon her responsibilities. She was someone trying to chart a path toward personal fulfillment without sacrificing her family. This balancing act became increasingly fragile, however, as tensions with Eric escalated. Arguments grew sharper, and words exchanged in private began to reflect deeper fractures in the relationship. It was the early hours of November 13, 2016, when a call crackled through to the Orange County Emergency Dispatch Center. On the line was a man who introduced himself as Dr. Eric Scott Sills, a respected fertility specialist, his tone clipped yet curiously controlled. He told the operator he had found his wife, Suzanne, at the bottom of the staircase inside their San Clemente home. She wasn't breathing. To the uninitiated ear, it sounded like the anguished plea of a husband stumbling upon an unthinkable tragedy. Paramedics and deputies were dispatched immediately, speeding through the quiet coastal streets, unaware that what awaited them would ignite one of the most scrutinized investigations the county had seen in years. When first responders entered the Sills residence, they found a scene that, at a glance, fit the story Eric had relayed. Suzanne lay motionless on the floor near the staircase, her body arranged in a way that suggested a fall. The home was otherwise calm. No overturned furniture, no obvious signs of forced entry. In many household tragedies, accidents like these were sadly common. Slips, trips, or a misstep on the stairs could end fatally in an instant. Yet something about this particular scene gnawed at the instincts of the professionals who arrived. Experienced paramedics know when details don't quite match the story given, and subtle inconsistencies began to surface almost immediately. For one, the injuries visible on Suzanne did not entirely resemble those typically caused by a fall. There was little external trauma consistent with tumbling down several steps. The lack of surrounding debris, no broken items or scattered personal effects, also seemed unusual for such an accident. Still, in those chaotic first moments, with Eric hovering nearby, the focus remained on the possibility, however slim, of reviving her. Medical personnel attempted resuscitation, but their efforts were futile. Suzanne Sills was pronounced dead in her own home, and her husband's account stood for the moment as the only explanation. Neighbors later recalled that the quiet cul-de-sac where the Sills family lived was disrupted that morning by the sudden appearance of flashing lights and emergency vehicles. Rumors quickly spread. Had there been an accident? Had Suzanne suffered a medical emergency? Outwardly, Eric appeared distraught but retained a degree of composure that some would later describe as odd. He repeated the same explanation. His wife had fallen down the stairs, and he had found her too late. For many, it was a believable story. After all, accidents inside the home are tragically common. But as hours passed and investigators began their routine assessments, subtle cracks began to appear in the narrative. The Orange County Sheriff's Department treated the scene with professional diligence. Even when deaths appear accidental, procedure demands careful documentation, especially when the victim is relatively young and healthy. Deputies photographed the staircase, the position of Suzanne's body, and the surrounding rooms. They noted details that might later prove relevant. A scarf loosely positioned, bruising patterns inconsistent with the story of a tumble, and the absence of telltale injuries like fractured limbs that stairway falls often produce. To an untrained observer, these details might have seemed insignificant, but for seasoned detectives, they were signals. Something about the discovery didn't add up. Eric's demeanor became another point of quiet scrutiny. He was, by training and profession, a man accustomed to crisis. In the medical world, doctors are often praised for their calm under pressure. Yet in the context of a spouse's sudden death, that same calm can feel unsettling. Witnesses described his tone as measured, almost clinical, lacking the raw anguish they might have expected. Of course, grief manifests in countless ways, and investigators are careful not to draw premature conclusions from behavior alone. But when combined with the emerging forensic anomalies, Eric's composure raised the first quiet questions. Was this really a simple accident, or was it something else entirely? The coroner's office took custody of Suzanne's body for autopsy, a step that would prove pivotal. In the hours before the examination, however, the official story remained unchanged. Publicly, it was still an accident. Friends who learned the news were stunned but did not initially suspect foul play. They thought of Suzanne as vibrant, energetic, and far too young to die, but they accepted the explanation given. Behind the scenes, however, forensic pathologists were preparing to answer the questions that photographs and statements alone could not resolve. The autopsy revealed the first definitive crack in Eric's narrative. Rather than injuries consistent with a fall, Suzanne's body bore signs of something more sinister. There were marks on her neck, distinct impressions that suggested pressure from an external object. Internal examination revealed damage to structures in the throat, injuries aligned with strangulation rather than blunt force trauma from a staircase. In addition, the distribution of bruising suggested a struggle, not the random pattern of a tumble. The findings were unequivocal. Suzanne had not simply fallen. She had been forcibly restrained, her life taken through deliberate means. When these results were relayed to detectives, the trajectory of the case shifted instantly. What had begun as an apparent household tragedy was now a homicide investigation. The discovery of her body at the foot of the stairs was, investigators concluded, a staged scene designed to mislead. Someone had attempted to rewrite the narrative of Suzanne's final moments, and suspicion naturally turned to the person who reported the death, her husband. As detectives revisited the house armed with this new perspective, their eyes adjusted to details they had previously logged but not fully interpreted. Bloodstains, faint but present, were discovered not near the staircase but in an upstairs bedroom. Specifically, the room where Suzanne had chosen to sleep that night because of a migraine. A clump of her hair was also recovered there, evidence of a violent confrontation. Suddenly, the tidy story of a slip and fall collapsed. The evidence suggested that Suzanne had been attacked in the bedroom, strangled, and then moved to the staircase to create the illusion of an accident. The discovery of her death, once framed as a tragic misstep, was now reframed as a calculated attempt. When investigators shifted their focus from accident to homicide, the most immediate and logical question emerged: who could have wanted Suzanne Sills dead? In cases of intimate partner homicide, statistics often point inward rather than outward. Strangers rarely enter suburban homes in the quiet hours of the night to commit carefully staged crimes. For detectives in Orange County, that statistical reality guided them back to the man who had called 911, Dr. Eric Scott Sills. His position as both the first witness and the husband placed him squarely in the center of suspicion. Still, suspicion alone could not carry a case of this magnitude. To transform theory into conviction, investigators would need to connect Eric not only circumstantially but conclusively to the death of his wife. Detectives began to peel back the layers of Suzanne's life, examining her recent behavior, her communications, and her state of mind. For the community that had admired the Sills family from afar, the realization was devastating. A mother who seemed to embody strength and compassion had been found lifeless in her own home, and the person who discovered her was now at the center of suspicion. The crime scene was no longer simply a staircase in San Clemente. It was a stage, carefully arranged to mislead, and the truth behind that staging would take investigators deep into the private world of Suzanne and Eric Sills. The first strand of connection lay in the forensic evidence itself. The autopsy revealed that Suzanne had been strangled, and the physical signs pointed to a ligature being involved rather than solely manual pressure. No foreign intruder was identified in the home, no evidence of forced entry was found, and valuables remained untouched. This absence of outside involvement narrowed the circle of potential perpetrators to those inside the house. On that night, it was Suzanne, Eric, and their twin children. Detectives quickly determined that the children were asleep and bore no connection to the violent confrontation. That left only one adult capable of staging the scene and contacting authorities afterward. The logical conclusion pointed back to Eric, though logic alone could not serve as proof. Investigators began to probe deeper, looking for fractures in the story that could tether motive and opportunity directly to him. Those fractures soon emerged in the form of blood evidence. While Suzanne's body had been discovered at the base of the staircase, stains and hair samples told another story: that the attack had occurred in an upstairs bedroom. To move a body from an upstairs bedroom to the foot of a staircase required not only time and effort, but also intent. Why would Eric, upon finding his wife lifeless, carry her elsewhere rather than immediately seeking help? The most plausible explanation was staging, an attempt to mislead investigators into believing a fall had occurred. This discovery did more than raise eyebrows. It tethered Eric to the act of deception, a hallmark behavior of perpetrators rather than grieving spouses. Investigators also turned to digital forensics, combing through Suzanne's phone, laptop, and messaging history. What they uncovered painted a portrait of a marriage under immense strain. Texts between Suzanne and Eric revealed a dynamic filled with tension and despair. "I want out," she had written in one message. "You are killing me," another stated. These were not isolated remarks, but part of a pattern suggesting that Suzanne was emotionally suffocating in the relationship. For prosecutors, these messages were invaluable. They provided a voice to the victim, one that hinted at both motive and state of mind. They revealed a woman who was contemplating separation, and in the eyes of the law, the prospect of separation often fuels volatility in domestic situations. For Eric, who was accustomed to control both in the operating room and at home, the possibility of losing his wife and unraveling the family's carefully curated image may have been intolerable. Further complicating the relationship was the revelation of Suzanne's online activity. Investigators discovered she had posted a topless photo in a chat room as part of a playful bet or dare. For some, it was harmless, a single act of impulsivity. But for Eric, who had accessed and preserved the conversation, it may have represented humiliation, betrayal, or simply loss of control. While no single piece of evidence could explain a murder, the cumulative weight of texts, digital activity, and forensic findings created a tapestry of motive and opportunity that seemed impossible to ignore. Eric's own statements became another thread in the web of connection. His 9/11 call and subsequent interviews with investigators contained inconsistencies that detectives found troubling. He described discovering his wife at the bottom of the stairs, but did not adequately explain why he had not heard a fall, why her injuries did not align with such a scenario. When pressed, his explanations often veered into the implausible. At one point, his defense would later argue that Suzanne had suffered a debilitating fall, fractured a vertebra, and that the family's dogs had then tugged on her scarf, leading to her strangulation. To investigators, this was less a defense than an admission of desperation. A theory so improbable it underscored the lack of credible explanation outside deliberate human action. Beyond physical and digital evidence, investigators also examined Eric's psychological profile. As a physician, he was trained in precision, control, and authority. In the fertility clinic, he was the figure patients deferred to, a man whose decisions carried life-altering consequences. That professional demeanor, however, did not always translate into the warmth or emotional availability Suzanne craved in their marriage. Friends of the couple noted the imbalance. Suzanne was vivacious, socially engaging, and eager for connection, while Eric was methodical, exacting, and sometimes emotionally distant. This imbalance over time may have deepened the cracks in their marriage. For law enforcement, this dynamic provided a psychological context. A man used to control, faced with a wife who was contemplating independence. That collision of forces often precedes domestic tragedy. The children, caught in the middle, offered limited but poignant insights. Too young to fully grasp the complexities of their parents' relationship, they were shielded from direct involvement in the investigation. Yet their mere presence on the night of the death raised the emotional stakes. For a mother devoted to her children, the idea of abruptly abandoning them seemed implausible. For a father facing suspicion, their proximity underscored the recklessness of staging such a crime in the family home. The tragedy was not confined to the loss of Suzanne. It extended to the twins, who now lived under the shadow of their mother's absence and their father's looming culpability. Community perception also shifted as the investigation unfolded. At first, neighbors had been shocked by the apparent accident, rushing to console Eric and express condolences. But as whispers of the autopsy findings spread, that sympathy gave way to suspicion. How could a respected doctor, a man entrusted with the most intimate hopes of families seeking children, be implicated in such a crime? The disconnect between Eric's professional image and the emerging portrait of his private life created a dissonance that fascinated and horrified those around him. The connection between suspect and victim was not only biological and marital, it was psychological and reputational, a bond that, when fractured, reverberated across every circle they inhabited. As evidence mounted, investigators faced the challenge of transforming suspicion into a prosecutable case. In homicide investigations, the leap from circumstantial connections to concrete charges must be airtight. The staging of the scene, the forensic evidence of strangulation, the digital communications, and the implausible explanations offered by Eric collectively built a case that prosecutors believed could stand before a jury. By 2017, Suzanne's death was officially declared a homicide. 2 years later, in 2019, Eric was arrested, a doctor now recast as an accused murderer. The connection between suspect and victim, once defined by marriage and professional partnership, was now enshrined in legal proceedings as adversarial. One woman silenced, one man accused of silencing her. For investigators, the connection to Eric was never a matter of a single smoking gun, but rather the cumulative weight of dozens of smaller threads. Each one, when woven together, created a portrait not of a grieving husband, but of a man desperate to maintain control, willing to reconstruct reality itself to avoid the consequences of his actions. The staircase, the scarf, the bedroom bloodstains, the texts, all of it converged on him. And in that convergence lay the foundation for what would become one of Orange County's most closely watched trials. When the Orange County District Attorney's Office finally moved to charge Dr. Eric Scott Sills with the murder of his wife, the case had already captured the attention of local media. The allegations were shocking. A respected physician, internationally recognized in the field of reproductive medicine, now accused of staging his wife's death in their own home. Yet what unfolded after his arrest would push the case far beyond the boundaries of Orange County courtrooms, transforming it into a story with international repercussions and a narrative of flight that blurred the lines between family duty, professional reputation, and criminal accountability. Eric's initial arrest in 2019 was met with disbelief in certain medical circles. Here was a man whose published research had appeared in academic journals, whose work in fertility had been celebrated across borders. To some, it seemed inconceivable that a physician of such stature could be capable of murder. To others, particularly those who had studied the forensic evidence, the charges appeared not only credible but inevitable. Eric was booked into custody, but unlike many defendants facing homicide charges, his situation was complicated by two undeniable facts. He was an American citizen with strong ties abroad, and he was the primary parent still present for his twin children. These circumstances laid the groundwork for the international saga that would follow. Shortly after his arrest, Eric was released on bail, a controversial decision given the seriousness of the charges. Prosecutors argued he posed a flight risk, but the court weighed his professional history, lack of prior criminal record, and parental responsibilities. Ultimately, he was permitted release under conditions meant to secure his presence for trial. Yet those safeguards proved insufficient. Not long after regaining his freedom, Eric quietly left the United States. His destination was Ireland, where he had professional connections, and, as it turned out, a foothold that would complicate any attempts at extradition. The move stunned prosecutors. For a man accused of killing his wife, leaving the country suggested not only flight, but a conscious effort to place himself beyond the easy reach of American courts. International law, however, is never straightforward. Extradition between nations requires agreements, paperwork, and time. Lots of time. Ireland, with its independent legal system and history of carefully scrutinizing extradition requests, was no exception. What might have seemed, on the surface, like a simple transfer of a fugitive from one jurisdiction to another quickly became a diplomatic and legal entanglement. Forensic evidence and witness testimony were already prepared for trial in California, but now prosecutors had to contend with the reality that their suspect was living openly abroad. Eric did not vanish into the shadows. Instead, he appeared to embrace life in Ireland, even continuing aspects of his professional work. This visibility became a source of frustration for those seeking justice for Suzanne. How could a man formerly charged with strangling his wife be allowed to carry on with a semblance of normalcy, while her family and friends continued to mourn and await accountability? The twins, still children at the time, were swept into this international turbulence. Custody battles and questions about their future became entangled with the criminal proceedings. With their mother gone and their father under indictment but physically beyond U.S. jurisdiction, the children's lives became a painful reminder of the human cost of the case. While prosecutors strategized about legal maneuvers, 2 young lives remained in limbo, divided between grief and uncertainty. This emotional undercurrent made the story resonate even more with the public, who saw not only a tale of forensic intrigue, but also of family tragedy extending across borders. Media coverage intensified as the case gained an international dimension. In Ireland, news outlets reported on the presence of an American doctor facing murder charges in California, sparking debates about whether he should be extradited or permitted to remain. In the United States, particularly in California, the narrative shifted from a domestic homicide to a story of evasion. Flight became synonymous with guilt in the eyes of many. Prosecutors seized on this perception, framing Eric's relocation not as an innocent decision but as a calculated move to escape justice. Defense attorneys, however, argued otherwise, claiming that his presence in Ireland was not an attempt to abscond but a matter of personal and professional necessity. They contended that Eric intended to clear his name, not run from it. The legal wrangling over extradition dragged on. International treaties dictate that extradition requests must meet strict evidentiary thresholds, demonstrating not only probable cause but also compatibility with the laws of the host nation. Defense attorneys in Ireland scrutinized the U.S. case against Eric, probing for weaknesses, inconsistencies, or aspects that might make extradition legally problematic. Every delay added time, and every passing month further distanced Eric from the courtroom in Orange County. For Suzanne's family, this was a bitter reality. Justice delayed felt increasingly like justice denied. At the same time, prosecutors in California sought to keep public attention on the case, ensuring that Eric's flight did not reframe the narrative in his favor. International observers noted the unusual nature of the case. It was not often that a high-profile physician, respected across 2 continents, became the subject of a transnational homicide proceeding. This made the case both more difficult and more visible. In Ireland, questions arose about the fairness of the U.S. system, the potential for media bias, and whether Eric would receive a fair trial if extradited. In California, prosecutors emphasized that fairness was precisely why they sought extradition. Eric deserved his day in court, but that day had to occur where the crime was committed, where the evidence lay, and where the victim had lived and died. For Eric, the international setting provided both a shield and a stage. Shield, because the legal complexities of extradition offered him more time and opportunity than he might have had if confined to the United States. Stage, because his continued visibility allowed him to maintain professional contacts, issue statements, and at times, cast himself as the victim of an overzealous prosecution. To some, he was a fugitive manipulating international boundaries. To others, he was a man fighting for his reputation in a system stacked against him. This duality fueled debates on both sides of the Atlantic. Every delay in proceedings, every argument in Irish courts, underscored the widening gap between what had happened on that November night in San Clemente and the accountability that had yet to follow. Ultimately, Eric's flight transformed the case from a domestic tragedy into a story with geopolitical consequences. It raised questions not only about guilt or innocence, but also about the ability of legal systems to respond when suspects cross borders. Could wealth, status, and international connections create loopholes that allowed accused individuals to evade justice? Or would the machinery of international law eventually grind forward, bringing him back to face trial? These questions gave the case a resonance far beyond the lives of those immediately involved, making it a touchstone in discussions about extradition, privilege, and the global pursuit of justice. When Eric Scott Sills was finally brought back into the orbit of the American justice system, the long wait for accountability began to narrow into the precise corridors of the courtroom. Prosecutors in Orange County had spent years piecing together every fragment of evidence. Now their challenge was to transform that mosaic into a narrative compelling enough to convince 12 jurors beyond a reasonable doubt. At the heart of the case stood the body of evidence that had already reshaped the story once before: Suzanne's autopsy. Forensic pathologists testified that her injuries were not consistent with a fall, as Eric had claimed. Jurors were shown diagrams, photographs, and charts that explained the difference between injuries caused by a stumble downstairs and those inflicted by deliberate force. The conclusion was unambiguous. Suzanne had been killed, and the scene at the bottom of the staircase had been a ruse. Prosecutors argued that Eric, facing the collapse of his marriage and the humiliation of Suzanne's online activity, lashed out in anger and desperation. The looming possibility of separation, they contended, threatened not only his personal pride, but also his control over the family's carefully curated life. The defense countered with a narrative that sought to dismantle both the forensic and emotional pillars of the prosecution's case. Their central claim was that Suzanne's death was a tragic accident, not a murder. Defense attorneys argued that the prosecution's version required jurors to believe Eric, a respected doctor, suddenly snapped and staged an elaborate crime scene in his own home with his children asleep nearby. They painted the state's case as circumstantial, built on interpretation rather than certainty. To bolster their claims, the defense called upon medical experts of their own, attempting to sow doubt about the autopsy findings. They argued that certain injuries could be misinterpreted, that strangulation and a fall might produce overlapping signs, and that the chaotic nature of emergency resuscitation could account for some of the anomalies. They also emphasized Eric's professional stature and lack of prior criminal behavior, framing him as an unlikely candidate for such a brutal act. The strategy was clear. If jurors could be persuaded to see even a sliver of reasonable doubt, the defense would succeed in undermining the state's narrative. The courtroom atmosphere was tense, a collision of cold forensic evidence and raw human emotion. Suzanne's family attended, their presence a silent reminder of the stakes. Their grief hung in the air, a counterweight to the defense's portrait of Eric as a wrongfully accused man. Eric himself remained a study in composure. Throughout the proceedings, he maintained the same clinical calm that had marked his early interactions with investigators. He sat at the defense table, flanked by attorneys, occasionally jotting notes, but never betraying the kind of visible anguish one might expect from a man on trial for his life. For some observers, his demeanor reinforced the prosecution's portrayal of him as cold and calculating. For others, it was the bearing of a physician accustomed to suppressing emotion in the face of crisis. The ambiguity of his presentation became part of the trial's narrative, leaving jurors to interpret whether his composure was evidence of guilt or simply personality. Public opinion, though not determinative in a courtroom, created a broader backdrop against which the trial unfolded. Prosecutors urged jurors to see the pattern, the autopsy findings, the staged scene, the digital messages, the lack of alternative suspects. They reminded them that reasonable doubt does not mean speculation. It means a genuine, evidence-based uncertainty. In this case, they argued, there was none. The defense, in turn, implored jurors to resist the pull of a narrative that seemed neat, but was, in their view, incomplete. The jury deliberations were long and arduous. Inside the deliberation room, jurors weighed expert testimony against personal intuition, scientific evidence against the defense's improbable alternative scenarios. The verdict, when it finally arrived, reverberated through the courtroom. For Suzanne's family, it was the culmination of years of waiting, of international delays, of emotional exhaustion. In March 2024, Eric Sills was sentenced to 15 years.